Welcome to a brand new study. Today, we're diving headfirst into an incredible investigative journey. We're going to explore the fascinating world of ancient texts and how some people are interpreting them to actually predict modern Middle Eastern geopolitics. We're going to look closely at some incredibly ancient words and map out exactly how they are currently being overlaid onto the absolute most breaking news headlines of our modern world. And honestly, understanding this perspective is absolutely crucial because thousands of people use these exact texts daily to interpret current events. So this study is vital for grasping a unique and highly influential geopolitical lens. It's a deep dive right into the intersection of theology, history, and modern conflict.
Now, before we really get going, I just want to set the stage a bit. This study is purely an exercise in neutral, impartial reporting. We're not taking sides or endorsing any specific political or religious viewpoints today. We're just objectively breaking down the claims and theories presented in our source material. And today's insights come straight from a dedicated researcher of ancient texts on the YouTube channel, Ken Johnson Bible Facts. The link is below in the description box, so definitely check that out. And to honor the community that requested this breakdown, prayers for the Watchmen channels are very much appreciated, and give a hype and like, please.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our 5-part map for today. 1. The prophetic calendars. 2. The fate of Elam. 3. Return of fallen angels. 4. Ancient words, modern weapons. And 5. Empires and end times.
Section 1. The prophetic calendars, ancient timekeeping. So, the source meticulously tracks potential dates for prophetic events by contrasting two totally distinct calendars. We're looking at the ancient Essene method of timekeeping, the one found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and comparing it directly with the modern Jewish calendar that's used today. The source points out a pretty massive discrepancy, especially when it comes to the timing of the Purim festival. Depending on which calendar you follow, Purim lands either on a Saturday and Sunday or a Monday and Tuesday. Now, you might be wondering, why does a 1 or 2 day difference matter so much to people tracking prophecy? Well, because if a major geopolitical strike happens on, say, a Tuesday, the source argues it unlocks a completely different prophetic timeline and a totally different set of expectations than if it happened on a Sunday. It's all about precision tracking and knowing exactly which chronological blueprint is unfolding right in front of us.
And that brings us to a really critical definition, the Jubilee. According to the source, a Jubilee marks the 50th year of a 50-year period. And the foundational belief here carries enormous dramatic weight. The channel actually argues that humanity is currently sitting in the next-to-last Jubilee of this age. So, according to this interpretation, we have entered the final prophetic generation. For followers of this theory, this translates to an intense anticipation of massive, imminent global shifts. It literally means the clock is effectively ticking down to zero, bringing this heightened sense of urgency to every single modern news headline as they wait for these earth-shaking events to unfold.
Section 2. The fate of Elam, geography and key players.
To understand the modern geopolitical game board, we really have to look back at the historical context of Elam. Elam was this ancient, powerful civilization situated in the far west and southwest of modern-day Iran. The source equates those ancient borders directly to the modern Iranian state. They base this heavily on the book of Jeremiah, chapter 49, which says, "Behold, I will break the bow of Elam, the chief of their might. I will bring the 4 winds and will scatter them." Just impartially reporting the channel's interpretation here, they believe this explicitly describes a future, devastating conflict involving Iran. The breaking of the bow signifies the sudden, absolute destruction of their military might, which then causes the civilian population to be scattered across the globe as displaced refugees.
The source actually maps out a very specific, step-by-step sequence for Iran's destiny based on this ancient text. And just think about the sheer emotional whiplash of this prophetic sequence for a second. Step 1 is the rise of a radical, oppressive government, which the channel argues actually occurred decades ago. Step 2 is a violent, prophesied war that suddenly breaks the military bow. Step 3 is the tragic scattering of citizens to all nations. But Step 4, well, it's a shocking twist ending. The source interprets the ancient text to say that ultimately, God's throne will be set in Elam. So the narrative arc goes from intense oppression and violent scattering all the way to a revived, secular, and God-fearing nation that eventually experiences a massive restorative spiritual revival. Pretty wild, right?
Section 3. Return of Fallen Angels, Dark Spiritual Forces. Now, to understand the dark spiritual forces supposedly operating behind the scenes of these physical conflicts, the channel leans heavily on the Book of Enoch. Enoch is a non-canonical ancient Jewish text that early Christians studied quite a bit, mostly known for expanding greatly on Genesis narratives regarding angelic beings. Chapter 56 states, "I saw the hosts of the angels of punishment going, and they held chains of iron and bronze." The source uses this to explain the theory that ancient fallen angels, these entities that rebelled millennia ago, are currently bound in permanent, unbreakable chains of iron and bronze. They are totally and permanently incarcerated until a future judgment day.
But here's where it gets intense. The source points out a terrifying exception to this rule. According to Revelation chapter 9, there are exactly 4 mighty angels bound specifically under the Euphrates River. The source notes that these 4 are a totally unique exception to the chained until judgment day rule. What's emphasized here is the terrifying precision of the prophecy. These entities aren't just broadly imprisoned. They are scheduled for a highly specific hour, day, month, and year. They are basically waiting for an exact, preordained moment to be unleashed right in the middle of a prophesied tribulation.
And the math the source presents regarding this release is, frankly, incredibly grim. The unleashing of these 4 entities allegedly commands an army that results in the destruction of a full 1/3 of mankind. 1/3. To put that into perspective, this apocalyptic scale is meant to completely reframe how we view physical wars happening on the ground today. For the source, geopolitical border shifting are just the surface ripples of a massive spiritual warfare cascading down into the physical realm.
And this brilliantly illustrates Section 4, Ancient Words, Modern Weapons, Apocalyptic Vocabulary.
The linguistic bridge built between the ancient world and today is truly fascinating. I mean, imagine the intense cognitive dissonance of an ancient prophet living in an agricultural Bronze Age society trying to describe a modern drone swarm or a nuclear exchange. They completely lack the vocabulary for modern weapons, so they had to rely on idioms. The bow, for example, represents long-range military strike capabilities. But even more fascinating is the ancient Hebrew word susim. While traditionally translated as horses, the root actually means leaping things. The source argues that an end-times invasion wouldn't rely on literal horseback riders. Instead, leaping things perfectly describes modern drones or evasive missiles hopping and dodging their way past advanced modern air defense systems like Patriot batteries. It's a real game-changer for how these texts are read.
This modernization of terms completely shifts how the source reads ancient texts. Take Enoch 56. The land of his elect ones will be before them as a threshing floor and a highway. Think of the stark contrast in imagery here. A literal agricultural threshing floor is where grain is violently crushed under heavy weight. The channel views this not as some ancient cavalry charge, but as a description of a massive, devastating aerial bombardment attempting to strike the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The text then goes on to describe a divine confusion falling over the invaders, leading to a scenario where advanced enemy forces completely lose coordination, their technology fails, and they mistakenly slaughter themselves in a massive wave of friendly fire.
Section 5. Empires and End Times. Historical Timelines. So, we're looking at the famous prophetic statue from the book of Daniel, broken down into historical empires: gold for Babylon, silver for Medo-Persia, brass for Greece, and iron for Rome. But it's the feet of the statue, a mixture of iron and clay, that is the main focus here. Iron and clay are historically and fundamentally unstable, right? Because they do not naturally mix or bind together. The channel outlines a theory that the final end-times empire will not just be a revived Roman system representing the iron, but it'll be unnaturally mingled with the clay, which the source specifically identifies as the ancient Egyptian empire. It's a highly specific theory regarding how ancient global powers are destined to recombine into this unstable final alliance.
During their Q&A segment, the source addressed biblical priesthoods. Now, this theological point is quite dense, but it's crucial. You've got the temporary Levitical priesthood, which basically acted strictly as a system of checks and balances. Powers were separated, and priests could never be kings. But contrasted against this is the order of Melchizedek. This ancient order removes the separation of powers entirely, combining the ultimate absolute authority of a king, priest, and prophet all into one eternal role. The source asserts this specific office is held exclusively by Christ, which fundamentally alters the spiritual and political hierarchy of the modern world in their view.
Finally, the source tackles a complex historical debate regarding the validity of a specific verse about the Trinity, 1 John 5:7. And the stakes of this historical debate are massive. If the verse was added later by translators, it fundamentally changes early church theology. But if the ancient scholar Jerome had access to older, now-lost texts, it completely validates the channel's stance on early Christian beliefs. The channel objectively points to quotes from church fathers like Tertullian around 200 AD and Cyprian in 250 AD, who referenced the Trinity concept long before the earliest surviving full Greek Bibles from 350 AD were even compiled. The timeline culminates in 541 AD with Jerome's Vulgate prologue, basically arguing for the deep historical validity of their theological worldview.
So, the crucial point is how seamlessly this source connects ancient theological texts to our modern geopolitical game board. To quickly summarize this entire study, the channel believes we're rapidly approaching the final Jubilee generation. They interpret scriptures as predicting both the violent destruction and the eventual beautiful spiritual revival of modern Iran. They argue that unseen, heavily scheduled spiritual forces are the true drivers of global unrest. They translate ancient terms like leaping things directly into modern drone warfare. And finally, they believe the world's final unstable political alliances are actively forming exactly as laid out in ancient visions.
It is a wildly complex, heavily layered, and incredibly dramatic framework for viewing reality. And it leaves us with this final thought. As ancient texts and modern headlines continue to collide, how will you decode the prophecies of tomorrow? Thank you so much for joining me in this study. Keep asking questions, keep looking at the source material, and keep learning.